everyone, Alex here.
And Louis.
And welcome back to Just English Talk, episode 2.
Episode 2. What's our focus today, buddy?
We're going to talk about an inspector calls, and I thought what might be interesting is for us to talk about the play and how it's relevant today. Because, very important part of your essays, trying to bring them into the modern era. How are they relevant to the times in which we live in? How are they still applicable? I mean, there's a reason why, not just with Inspector Calls, but Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Christmas Carol, Jekyll and Hyde, the poetry that you study too, has a real cultural relevance and resonance, which is another good word, because these stories never really go out of style. So I thought it might be interesting for us to talk a little bit about the characters in the play, and really what their function is, not just, at the time at which Priestley was writing, but also how we might be able to sort of modernise them a little bit and bring them into the current era.
Nice, yeah, and I think that one of the ways of really getting into kind of the very top band when it comes to AO3 or context is to occasionally differentiate between what we call context of production and context of reception. So context of production is everything that applied to the time when the author was writing the work. So obviously what was going on historically, socially, politically, biographically for them, in the literary trends, etc., etc. And then context of reception are what's going on in terms of the audience. And the audience, there are kind of two audiences. We have the audience who kind of when it was intended for at the first, the point of conception, and then obviously a modern audience, and making, recognising that there is a difference quite often in how these texts are going to be perceived and received by those different audiences is quite a nice way of getting not only kind of two bits of contextual analysis for the price of one, but also just kind of really showing the depth of your insights.
Absolutely, and it's one that students often miss because it's very. I guess you as young writers spend so much time being spoken to about. In this case, 1945 and its comparisons with 1912, and rightly so, because it's an incredibly important part of the play. But examiners are always interested in new interpretations and new things that can be said, and I guess that's where we're going to try and come in and sort of bring them where possible into 2025, because that's where we are.
2025, wild. When did that happen?
I don't know. 80 years since that play was first performed. That was my quick...
Rapid maths.
I know. I've been working on my mental maths.
That's good.
We're going to talk about the characters in the order that they are interrogated.
Yes.
Or questioned.
Yes, it's probably a fairer term.
Poked at, by the inspector.
Prodded by the bear.
So who's the first one?
So the first one is going to be Birling.
Yes,
Mr.
right.
Birling, Arthur, to his friends. And so I think probably the most interesting way to think about Arthur is in terms of that kind of three time periods that we have.
Yep.
We have 1912 when he's speaking.
Yep.
We have 1945 when an audience is first responding to him. And we have, of course, 2025 and all of the intervening years during which time audiences have been encountering him. So in terms of 1912, the delightful thing about having this lovely kind of pre-war to post-war gap between setting and conceiving of the play is that you can see how wrong he is in every single way. And I think the kind of the overall message, what Priestley's doing here, and it's very, very clear and obvious that he's going, here are all the facts that he was wrong about. By extension, his opinions must be wrong too.
Yep.
And that's kind of what we interpret from that. So Alex, talk me through, what does he get wrong?
Well, where do we begin? The Germans don't want war. Okay, well, they do want war. The Titanic is absolutely unsinkable. Spoiler alert, is very sinkable. He says something about some hot-headed or something along those lines in the Balkans. He's sort of making these wide assertions about the impending, or whispers, as it were, of war. He just does not believe. There's never been a better time to be a young person.
Yeah,
You know,
to have great prosperity ahead.
So, you know, Priestley is nailing his colours right to the mast here, isn't he?
Yeah.
Early doors, and sort of showing you that this is not a man who can be trusted. But it's also very much like, he's a very classic man, isn't he?
Yeah.
You know, a real sense of like surety of self, like I am right, because that's what he wants to say. I'm a man, I'm right, I'm always right. He's an older man in this context. When he makes the biggest pronouncements, he's kind of sat in front of Gerald and he's showing off, really, isn't he? He's trying to be like, look at me, I'm Mr. Birling, I'm the big man, I'm the businessman, and you know, I know things, right? I'm wise, I'm old, I've been through it all, I've seen everything that you've been through, I've been a young man.
And he's loving it, isn't he? He's loving this opportunity to be big boss.
Exactly, and he's got his drink, you know, and he's sat there, and he's probably, you can imagine his legs are wide open, and he's kicking back, you know,
He's got a cigar as well as his whiskey.
Precisely, and you know, he, in at no point do I think that it ever crosses his mind that he could be wrong, right?
No, he is the patriarch of the family, and that gives him a lot of self-assurance.
Yeah.
And he, excellent word, pontificates at length. And you have to remember that he's gathered himself an audience right now to listen to him holding forth on how he's so right about things.
Yeah.
And, of course, he's so wrong about, obviously, you mentioned Titanic and war.
Yeah.
He also talks about there being kind of capital versus labour agitations that'll all die down.
Yes.
And he was obviously wildly wrong about that because, you know, unemployment was due to skyrocket, and the number of people in trade unions was going to pretty much double. You know, getting millions on millions per year joining these trade unions. All the strikes that were happening in the 20s and 30s, he was so wildly wrong about those things. My favourite moment, though, which is quite a subtle one, he says something along the lines of, it would be a great time for progress and prosperity, except for Russia, who will naturally always be a little bit further behind.
Yeah.
Which is just delightful when you obviously, it's kind of like he's wrongly predicting the future, not even just the present from when it's written, because you fast forward to the 60s and you've of course got the space race, and there are only really two names in it, which is obviously the US
and the Soviet Union.
And
of course the play was first produced and performed in the Soviet Union.
Indeed.
You know, in a nice little, I guess, tip of Priestley's hat to the sort of socialist, you know, basis of the play. So in 1912, what are we saying? We're saying that he is your quintessential
another great word.
Sort of business owner.
Hot-headed man of business.
Hard-headed man
of business.
It's easy. It's an easy one to mistake. And actually, I will say, you know, main question. So if I get, you know, one question, one quote, one word wrong of a quote, or one tiny piece, will I get, you know, 0 marks? No. You know, you're given a lot of leeway, particularly on this question where there's no extract, and you know it's sort of 2 to choose from, etc. So don't you worry if you say hot instead of hard or hard instead of hot. It's no issue.
Unless you're a teacher, in which case, stay up all night worrying about it.
Exactly, and think of it for weeks and weeks and weeks. Okay, well let's just shift forward then a little bit. 1945. What are people there thinking about Birling?
He's a throwback, isn't he? He's a proper kind of. He's a bit of a kind of a martinet, an outdated kind of a relic of this time when you could be confident and you could be confidently conservative. Whereas by the time we get to 1945, we're approaching general election. Labour are going to win an unprecedented landslide. Churchill, the nation's favourite kind of figure of war, is going to be trounced by Clement Attlee, and we're going to have a brand new kind of government set up where the concepts of conservatism and capitalism are going to be kind of pushed to the edges by a much more socialist, much more kind of for the people sort of approach to politics. And that's been building for a long time. And obviously the audience at the time, they know that this is coming, that there's been a shift in public perception about conservatism. less so about capitalism, but with all of the unemployment, people are starting to go, hey, maybe this thing isn't actually the be-all, end-all. So we find ourselves in a situation where we're looking back on this very confident, smug, very wrong gentleman who is now out of his time in 1945 already after those two world wars.
It's funny even in such a short space of time that somebody like him could, I guess, already be a caricature of a business owner. Because I guess if we think about the ways that he was wrong, there will be many, or would have been many men. We'll focus on men just for a moment here, who probably look at Birling and think, "Wow, I really got things like this wrong too." I can't be as confident in my beliefs because there'll have been people in the audience of 1945 watching that play who had possibly fought in both wars. I mean, I'm not going to do the maths here. I'm sure there was at least one person who had fought. Who had fought in both, and had probably at the end of the first one gone, wow, that will never happen again. That was horrible. And then literally sort of 20 years later, it is happening again, and you're back. And so there's a lot of people, I guess, who are thinking, everything that I was sure of has been ripped up multiple times. So there is no possible way that I can call what's going to happen in the next 5 years, maybe even 5 months. They're incredibly turbulent times. I always like to kind of point out to students, if you imagine, because we're going to come to sort of modern era in a moment, but if you think about being born in 1900, so you're born in 1900 and you're 0 years old, you're a little baby, you're 14, World War One, you're 18, World War One ends, you're 23, what's that, Wall Street crash, 1923, so massive, start of depression, you have an influenza epidemic in there, you have kind of very, we come out of this era of depression, and then you start to see the rise of these of fascism in the 30s. You're keeping an eye on that. You've probably children on the way, because people were having children much younger. Then you hit 39 and World War II. I'm skipping over some things in the middle of there, but these are some big moments. You get to 45, World War II ends. Then you have socialism. Labour government come in. Oh, great, baby booming. Everyone's sort of come on, let's live our lives. You get rock and roll starting to emerge in the 50s. You get space rate. By the time you're 80, if you're lucky enough, to be born in 1900 and live to 100 and die in 2000, you must just grow older and older and older and think this is just wild. All of the change that you've seen in your life, and that's again, just to bring it back to Birling, that's how he can seem so anachronistic, right? To even people that short space of time, which leads me now 2025. Now I think there might be some reappraisal of Birling.
Interesting.
And I'm going to put it out there. Okay, so what does he do? I'm going to ask you this question. What does he do that's wrong?
What does he do that's wrong? Okay, so he puts his business first. He puts his family and realistically himself first.
Okay, what's wrong with that? I'm playing devil's advocate here for the sake.
Of course.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with putting your family first?
If you put your family first at the expense of your number one, your responsibilities to the people who are around you, and then number two, your broader responsibilities to society, and then kind of that kind of social obligation that you have, then you are essentially, if you have the power to put your family first, it sounds great, but not everybody does have the power to put their family first, and their family will end up suffering. And so it's a very privileged position to be in, to go, I'm just putting my family first. If everyone did this, every family would be fine.
True.
But that's kind of where you make the mistake of the leap of logic of going, not everyone can use the same resources and power to put their family first. Because what you're really doing, when you say put your family first, you're not just putting them first in your priorities, you're putting them first as in ahead of everyone else in society. So that's what would be wrong about it in certainly in kind of 1912.
Yeah.
Much kind of more significant rich-poor divide.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of putting your business first, you certainly nowadays, and it's kind of written into employment law, that you have a lot more kind of responsibilities to your employees.
True.
And that's where I think a lot of modern audiences are particularly kind of blindsided by his
Well, you
behaviour.
couldn't do the things that he does.
No.
You just by law you can't. But the laws hadn't been established well enough at that point,
No,
right?
exactly.
For the protections and actually what you see, by sort of looking at the way that he treats Eva and other people in his factories is that you see in a weird way the foundation of how we have things like protection of people in unions in certain sectors, and you have whatever it is, sick pay and even holiday and all these kind of things that which have been slowly, which even then in 1912 was sort of slowly coming to the fore.
Well, yeah, and I would just jump in for a second
Yeah.
there to think that some of those things came about as a result of that Labour government that we mentioned. So kind of like national insurance, for example, I think that was during Clement Attlee's
Reign. Reign, is that the right?
Reign?
No, not reign.
tenure. Office, no.
Yes.
During his time.
During his
government's
time in power in the government. Yeah.
I think that's when national insurance came in, which obviously accounts for a lot of things like sick pay, and obviously the like unions.
Yeah.
If we talk about it just kind of statistically, you had maybe like 4 million people, members of trade unions in 1912. By 1945, you've got just under 8 million.
Oh, wow.
So you had like a massive
Interesting.
increase in interest in that particular area. And so you're absolutely right. When you have it set at the beginning of that kind of uptick, you get to see why. Why has that become so important to people? And things that we would just overlook today as just part and parcel of being employed were not even in place at the time. And so, do go on.
But yeah, no, we were on a slight tangent. I guess what I was sort of poking the bear to say was that I think in 2025, if you look at Birling's sort of how he arrives at his wealth, he's self-made, right? He makes the comments to us about his wife Sybil Birling's family not being massively enamoured or happy with him because she's obviously this kind of aristocratic landed gentry, old money. Yeah, he's new money, right? This kind of, and I just think that in our modern era, right? We pride in this country, businessmen, people who start businesses, that classic Middle England, starting your own little shop and it grows and you're selling your sweets and one day you're selling just little sweets and then you're a multi-million-pound sweet business, whatever it is. Dragon's Den, think of all of these kind of TV shows about sort of commerce and we
and even like social media, the whole like rise and grind mentality.
Exactly.
It's like
right.
I get up at 4:30 a.m. so I can meditate and go to the gym and then start my business before I go to my main job.
I fit 4 days into your one day. I've done them all. I've done a whole day by the time you've woken up.
We celebrate it, don't we?
Yeah, and so I think that there's an element. The reason why I was sort of asking you about putting your family first, I think that these, and we can we may not get into the kind of reasons why these things are coming up, or back into the fore, but I just think that there is a sort of underlying, we can have an underlying respect for aspects of Birling's mentality because he's if you take the purely business-based approach, and he talks about like lower. Lower costs, higher prices. And he talks about, she was asking for the earth and, if you give him the earth and these kinds of things. I'm not necessarily agreeing with what he's saying, but you could play, if you just imagined yourself as a business owner like him, you can understand the reason why he makes these arguments, right? Because he's, I'm a businessman, they have to make tough decisions. My responsibility is to my family. And you're completely right. He's privileged that he can even be in that position in the first place. I just wonder if his everything or nothing capitalism approach is sort of back in a way, isn't it? Because even if you look politically in 2025, the kind of socialist ideas and things, they're under threat, they're being pushed back against, not just in the UK, but all around the world. And people like Birling are becoming fashionable, as it were, again.
Yeah, billionaires are our biggest type of celebrities at the moment. I mean, you hear more news about Elon Musk than you hear about pretty much any public figure at this point in time. This week in January, you're hearing more about Elon Musk than anyone else. And why is he famous? Is it because he's a smart guy? Questionable. Is it because he is sharing lots of really interesting ideas? Questionable. It's because he's a billionaire.
Yeah.
And because he's a billionaire, he has this exposure.
Yeah.
He's made friends in high places.
Yeah.
And he's able to do that. And so people are going, oh, wow, Elon.
Yeah.
What a guy. What a climb.
Yeah.
And so we do have this newfound interest in...
Yeah. Maybe interest is a better word than respect.
Well,
I guess
no, a lot of people do, though.
Yeah.
That's the thing, that there are a lot of people who are massively behind these billionaires. And it would be very easy to get political in this discussion and talk about how morally permissible it even is for billionaires to exist, and how they got there. We're not going to do that,
no,
because that's not going to be relevant. But it's absolutely fair to say, and I completely agree with you, that I think a lot of people, and I've taught students as well who have who've defended Birling to the end, even with all of the lessons that we did and kind of the point of the play and all of that, they still go, yeah, he made wise business decisions, and then he made decisions to try and protect himself and his family. Individualistic society, that's how we should do. If everyone did that, then everyone would take care of their own and we would all be fine.
Yeah.
And
I guess I guess what people kind of, what if you're writing and you're thinking, bringing it into this sort of modern, position in time, I guess you have to try and think like, it's hard to say what Priestley would think, and that's not really always massively possible, but certainly like he has written this play in defense of socialist values, right? Undoubtedly. In 2025, what is the position of said values? Do we still have them? Yeah, we do. We still believe in NHS, free at the point of use. We still believe in protection of workers and employees, versus being exploited by their bosses and this kind of thing. We have all of these things in place. It's just that can they coexist with this celebrity status of the big Birling-esque figure? And yeah, that's a whole other podcast in itself, to discuss whether it can. I just think that if a question in the this year's exam series came up about Birling, I think there is some interesting digging that we can do. And remember, just for the sake of, no examiner wants to read 4 pages long.
I was going to say, this is a sentence.
Or 2 sentences.
How do we put it in a sentence or 2?
Yeah.
So how are we going to put it in a sentence or 2?
Great question.
We could make reference to the 3 time zones.
Yeah.
Couldn't we? We could say, in 1912, he is pompous, pontificating patriarch.
Love it.
The 3
PPPs. Yeah.
By 1945, his way of life is being massively challenged by everything that's happened in the interim between 1912 and 1945. And by 2025, when we're reading it, we are reacting potentially, and this is kind of the argument we're making. Potentially, there are some people reacting with a more kind of more understanding lens on Birling, going, my man's just trying to protect the business and the family. And it can certainly be argued. It's not necessarily something you have to agree with or disagree with, but it's an angle.
Totally.
And that could be a sentence.
Yeah.
Quite easily. And a way of kind of signposting to your examiner that you are doing context might be to say kind of, you can even throw in like really on the nose phrases like contextually speaking.
Yes, that's a good one. This reflects the values of 1912 because, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Those signposts, and particularly the use of dates or eras. So you can refer to kind of the Edwardian period if you're talking about who's on the throne. You can talk about the early 20th century if you're talking about like centuries.
Yeah.
You can talk about what else could you do? How else could you do it? You could talk about it at just the modern period, because this is the modern text. Most people would say that post 1910 is like,
21st century sort of attitudes.
Yeah.
Probably not the Carolian era, because that's what we're in right now.
Probably not,
It
no.
comes across as a little bit jarring, I would imagine. Although I guess, if you popped it in and I was reading your essay, I'd say, hey, well done for looking that up.
Yeah.
The old Carolian.
Yes. So those signposts, you throw them in. You might make a quick reference to those 3 points in time.
Yeah.
Bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah.
You've said something interesting.
Yes.
Nice context. You haven't spent a whole paragraph or a whole page or anything like that. It's obviously not what we were trying to encourage here.
No.
But you can distill and compress what we've just been exploring into just those quick kind of like bam, bam, bam. And therefore you've said something really interesting rather than just Birling is a capitalist. Priestley is
a socialist, and they hate each other.
Yeah, and it's a bit lame. Like, you can tick a box for AO3, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And as examiners, we have acknowledged that counts as context.
Yeah.
We've awarded marks for it, but it's not going to be top end.
No.
No.
Cool. So that's Birling.
That's Birling.
Right. Next up,
Sheila.
Sheila.
His daughter. I love Sheila.
Do you?
Sheila is my favourite character.
Yeah. No, she's amazing. She's amazing. What do you love about her?
I think the reason that I love Sheila is not because of anything necessarily lovable about her, but her arc is just fantastic. Yeah. And it's kind of the point that she's the only one of them who has a legitimate character arc.
Yeah.
That is in any way kind of productive.
Yeah.
But
and while I just interject,
yeah.
sorry, just for 1 sec, while I think of it as well, maybe the only, at least if you're studying the kind of classic Macbeth, Christmas Carol, Inspector Calls conflict poetry, the only female character that really has an arc.
Yeah.
That stands out, and it's not just, Belle really only exists to serve the story of Scrooge, right?
Yes, yes, exactly.
But anyway, yeah, go on, carry on.
Yeah, so I just think it's a real delight to kind of track her through the play.
Yeah.
Just to see her starting off as kind of, she's described as kind of like in her early 20s,
yeah.
good looking, pleased with herself is in the stage directions.
Yeah.
She literally misses part of her father's very important speech because she's admiring her engagement ring.
Yeah.
She calls her parents mummy and daddy.
Yeah.
When she first hears about Eva's suicide, she goes, "Oh, I wish you hadn't told me.
Yeah.
It's ruined my evening." She says, "I was having such a nice time tonight." To see her go from that to shouting at her parents to stop incriminating themselves and to stop ignoring the point of the inspector. Yeah. I just love seeing that glow up.
Yeah, it's
That's
amazing.
why I love her.
Yeah, no, and she's a beacon of hope, isn't she? In the play, she's a kind of, if everybody who makes mistakes, which is everyone, and like this is the thing, Priestley's not saying I'm the most perfect person who ever lived, and there's only socialist perfect. No, he's saying we have all, in our own way, most likely messed up, right, somehow along the way, and that's that's what happened. That's life. The key is what you do after, and you need to Sheila, as it were.
Yeah. Sheila as a verb.
You need to Sheila yourself and say, look, I did this and I had this attitude and I saw the world in this way. And I was privileged and sheltered and sort of playing into a stereotype of what society expected, in this case of women. But I don't have to stay that way. Yeah. I can change, right? And that's like that is the foundation of the play, isn't it? Really, it's just
that really is the crux.
Yeah, it's like if we can all change, then things will be better, right?
And that moment where they make it explicit, where I think it's Mrs. Birling says, "You've made quite an impression on this child inspector," and he says, "We often do on the young ones." It's such a great moment there to just go, "Hey, you in the audience, old folks, your time's gone, mate. You're done. This is the new generation. They are progressive. They are more socialist. They are, because of their youth, they are like open to these ideas. Yeah. You are an old stick in the mud. Yeah. You are going to end up in the worst situation out of all of this. This is what hope looks like."
Totally.
And it's a real kind of message about, I think, I think, encouraging an audience
Yeah.
as well, like a 1945 audience, to go, look at what you can do, whatever you're beginning, whatever the situation you were in initially, look at what you can do in terms of your progressive attitudes and your politics and the way that you change yourself.
Yeah.
Because there's still stuff that needs to be done.
Yes.
And that's a crucial thing to bear in mind at this point as well, is that a lot of the time, Priestley is being quite smug.
Yep.
You know, because by 1945, so many of these issues with 1912 have been, Birling's been proved wrong.
Yes,
essentially.
exactly. Yeah.
All of these things have changed.
And the
for
tide is
better.
going in his political
Exactly.
direction. You know, he's on the winning ticket here.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it's such a and so as a result, it's quite often you could perceive it as smugness. I certainly do. Like that kind of, you go, ha ha ha, I know what's happened since
Totally.
1912, and it's all coming up Priestley.
Yeah.
But this one area is still getting progressively worse, and that's unemployment.
Yes.
So I think when we're talking about Birling and Sheila, who are both responsible for getting Eva fired, it's a good time to mention the fact that in 1912, when it's set, unemployment in this country was only around 3%.
Yeah.
And so it's really the fact that it's in a very industrial town.
Yes.
That her losing her job is quite significant, because what else is she going to do? Like another factory, the exact same situation.
And the implication, of course, like, you get fired from one, these guys are all meeting at the, what's the name of the Palace Bar?
The Palace Bar, yeah.
All these kind of meggy figures and these sort of men and smoking and sort of, lecherous behaviour.
Bit of a boys' club.
Yeah, boys' club, ogling women and sort of this kind of, and just being generally not very nice.
Yeah.
And you would imagine, although not explicitly stated in the play, talking to each other about, who's who and who to sort of who you can. And so the fact that she then lands on her feet in a way and manages to get this job in Millwards.
It's lucky, and they point out that it's lucky.
Yeah.
She was lucky to get that job, and she got it because there was, the flu. The flu was around. The influenza was surging in cases, and really, that's not much of a comment on the national picture of 1912, because 3% unemployment is actually fairly good in relative terms. By 1932, like you see this massive uptick in unemployment, particularly the interwar period. So like during the war, most people are, enlisted for the war effort in one way or another. But in the interwar period, it absolutely surged, and we have nearly a quarter unemployment in the country. I think like 23% in 1932. And so
Crazy.
this comment of kind of, and it doesn't go back down much, but like it still hovers around like an average of about 15% in that entire interwar period. And so Priestley is recognizing that, you know what, this is something that still needs work. And so to say we've got this younger generation who can be influenced, particularly an individual from the younger generation who causes her to lose her job, and, features in unemployment, is also one who can see, I don't want to do that to anyone ever and ever again, and it has the capacity to change. And so they, as you called her, a beacon of hope for the 1945 audience who still have work to do to improve the situation. So it's quite an interesting sort of like, quite an interesting lens to notice that Priestley is not just smug all the time, because socialism has won.
Yeah, there are problems to be tackled. I mean, we just to bring it momentarily, I guess, modern era, sort of this, we're in a similarly post-pandemic period, right? So, if you think about the parallels of, as you mentioned, people her getting the job because of this flu, and then, people being sick, and then war, and all these kind of big social events that have kind of had an impact on unemployment. We have a modern issue with, dealing with the fact that so many people are still very poorly, based after this. Who is going to be the one who sort of stands up and tries to change these working environments? You see, for example, a lot of companies in 2025 kind of pushing back against the things that would help the more, what's the word? Yeah, the more sick people working from home. They're trying to bring them back to the office. They're kind of threatening them as opposed to being compassionate. It's almost like we haven't learned the lessons that these kind of stick as opposed to carrot approaches to encouraging and supporting people do not tend to work,
Yeah.
right? And that what you actually, what you need, and I guess what you would imagine that the Sheilas, and it's important just for a second to think that like these characters are, they are characters, but they're symbols really, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're kind of, they represent a much bigger thing, and in this case Sheila, and to an extent we'll get onto him later, Eric as well, the younger generation who will pick up the pieces, and what are they going to do? And it's the same today, like what will the next generation of young people leaving school in their 18, 19, 20, 21, what is their attitude going to be? Because they're the ones who've been affected the most, I guess, by recent developments.
Yeah, it's a really interesting angle, isn't it? And it's playing into, a lot of people would kind of suggest that it's very difficult to label the play with a genre, but it's playing into a very old medieval tradition of morality plays.
Yeah.
And a morality play is intended to teach a moral message to its audience, and the way that it does it is through archetypes rather than actual characters. And so you'll have a character, for example, just called Justice, and they represent justice, and they enact justice. And isn't that just the inspector?
Yeah, pretty much.
And so you have these character types, and so kind of having the representatives of the younger generation, the future, the progressives, very much kind of leaning into that tradition, which is, as I say, many centuries old, but a lot of people call it, it's not strictly speaking a morality play. And so if you were to talk about this in the exam, you wouldn't call it morality play, because your examiner would go, we're several centuries too late to be calling it that. But you can say that it's playing into a literary tradition of the morality play, and taking elements from it. And I think that it certainly does that. But you're absolutely right. It's this kind of this lovely invitation to an audience whenever you pick up the play, whether it's 1945 or 2025 or any of the years in between, an invitation to go out and Sheila, be more Sheila, and therefore kind of change society for the better by learning a lesson from her mistakes. And I think you're absolutely right to say it's really important to note that she had to make that mistake first before she learned.
Because that's, everyone makes mistakes, and you can't learn without them. I think just as a small, while it's in my head and on the subjects of Sheila and sort of, 1912, 1945, modern, just in her role as a woman in the play, I've always thought, so, we're riding the 1912, we're still pre-vote, women having the vote on a kind of, so, they're not able to sort of contribute politically yet at that point. 1945, post-war, we know all the stories of women, filling the roles of the jobs of men, and sort of essentially, and even after the First World War to an extent as well, kind of saying, look, we're not going back, to the kind of domestic life. We want to play an active role, and the first step is being able to, be democratic. And it always made me think of, just back to this firing and the jealousy that she feels towards Eva. I have wondered if so it's presented to us that she sees Eva trying on this dress, and Eva smiles, and then Sheila sees this, and she's jealous because of the way that she looks, right?
Yeah.
I've wondered if there's another layer to that, which is actually about freedom, and that, because Eva is, to an extent, like, of course, she faces a lot of judgment and challenge and etc. in her life, but she has a freedom that Sheila doesn't have, right? She is living an independent life. It's not like a great one. In fact, it's pretty tough, but she is doing her own thing, right? Yeah. She's like forging her way in the world and working, and she has a kind of, she's emancipated in a way that Sheila isn't, right? And I wonder if Priestley sort of is highlighting this insofar as we need to have more women in, women need to be given more freedom, right? The freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to live and contribute, in terms of, like, for their own happiness. But it's not just about happiness. It's about like, it comes back to mistakes. Like, if you make a mistake, at least it's yours.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, okay, I messed up and something didn't go my way, but look, I'm living my life, you know, and
such an interesting angle.
yeah, and then by 20, you know, fast forward to now again, we have, you know, again, women are free, as it were, you know, for want of a better phrase. But again, they are just trying to live their lives.
You know what I think is really interesting about what you just said as well is that the way that society has changed since 1945.
Yeah.
You have this free character in the form of Eva Smith, but she's not able really to capitalize on that freedom because she's never going to earn more than a certain amount. She's never going to have the generational wealth that would allow her to be kind of as free as she would like to be. People in her situation are not going to experience all the joys that freedom can bring. Even if Sheila might see it as like, oh, she's so free, I wish I could have had that. In every other way, she's screwed over. And that's because there are so many things that structurally in society we have now that would mean that, you know, women can be independent and free. And one of them is to do with like, obviously we've talked about like job security, but also pay, but also, you know, things like maternity leave.
Yeah.
Also things like contraception.
Yeah.
A lot of people have argued, and I agree with them personally, I don't know what you think, that the single most significant social change that has ever happened for women is the availability of contraception.
Yeah.
And the reason, there are loads and loads of kind of snowballing reasons, but kind of the core reason for that is because one of the most common ways to control women's freedoms and limit their freedoms is for them to be pregnant.
Yeah.
Without them wanting to be pregnant.
Yeah, of course.
We see that, of course, obviously in the form of Eric.
Yep.
This is an unwanted pregnancy.
Yeah.
But we also see it just kind of more broadly in the fact that once she is pregnant, she is at the mercy of Mrs. Birling.
Yeah.
You know, she needs charity aid or she needs a husband to support her. And that freedom that we've just talked about in 2025, that's afforded by the structures in society that allow women to be free, that allow women to be...
So the state fills the gap. As in the play a charity has to fill, and then I guess the comment that the Priestley's making really, isn't he, is that charity's all well and good, but it appears to be at the mercy of personal feeling, and that's not a way to run a society. It's like, you know, the state has to intervene there because the state should be a non-partisan, non-personal, just purely, you know, what's the word, sterile in some ways, approach to providing these services, right? Like, you know, everyone gets it. And that's the thing, isn't it? Like, everyone gets it. You know, whether you're the richest person in Britain or the poorest, you can get access to maternity leave, right? You know, and that doesn't, you know, it's not done on a kind of case-by-case basis or through whispers and rumours of, you know, what did she call herself, Mrs. But, you know, this kind of stuff.
And hence the creation of the welfare state, again, Clement Attlee's Labour government.
Totally. Okay, so that's, I think, Sheila.
Yeah, it's a line drawn for now under Sheila.
Yeah, under Sheila. I would suggest, how are we doing for our time today, Louis?
We're over 40 minutes in.
Okay, nice. Well, let's wrap it up with one more character, shall we? I would say, in the order of things, we go to Gerald.
I would say Gerald too, because then we also have a representative, don't we, of the older generation in Mr. Birling, the younger generation in Sheila,
and then this
weird.
where
do
he?
we put him? Yeah,
The dandy generation.
The dandy.
I mean, I think he's meant to be. Yeah, I've always put it like this: he is probably not. He's not much older than Sheila, right? He's closer in age to Sheila than he is to Mr. Birling.
Yep.
He represents the type of person, male or female, who wishes things could be the same as it was for his parents' generation, right? But knows deep down that actually, no. Like, I can't have meat with every meal, breakfast, lunch and dinner, 7 days a week like my forefathers did, because I realise now that it's not a good thing to do for the environment, right? That kind of attitude, like I wish I could just only eat bacon, 4 times a day, but I can't, right? It's that attitude. He wishes that everything was on a plate, like for Mr. Birling's, and Mrs. Birling's and those kind of people. But the people he's most close in age to around him are changing.
Yeah.
And he has to make a decision, doesn't he? That kind of person. Like, am I going to try and maintain, like, hold on everything I can to maintain the status quo? Or am I going to take a risk, probably affecting myself financially, affecting my desires, because, as we'll get into, I'm sure, he is an adulterer, he would probably rather society kept on allowing him to be able to have his cake and eat it too, with regards to women.
Yeah.
He doesn't really want to take responsibility.
No.
And so he sits in this, like, he's probably Priestley's, like, one of his chief targets, isn't he? That kind of person in society.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so interesting that the stage directions say that he's a little bit too masculine to be a dandy, but is still very much the well-dressed man about town kind of thing. And it's really interesting because that reference to being a dandy, and just to kind of explain what a dandy is, a dandy is someone whose family is kind of so wealthy that they don't need to work, and so they can just socialise at any time that they want to.
A socialite.
Yes, exactly. A socialite.
Yeah,
dandy is very much a socialite. And it's saying that he's slightly too masculine. What he really mean, what those stage directions are really saying by him being slightly too masculine to be a dandy, is that he also wants to hold on to this idea of being a hard-headed man of business.
Yeah.
Very obviously to me,
Yeah.
it's Mr. Croft Senior.
Yes.
Who is the hard-headed man of business.
Yeah.
That allows Gerald to walk about in a suit and look like a hard-headed man of business, have all of this cash to flash, and be exactly who he wants to be. He has the greatest freedom, I think, of anyone, because he's not really that involved in the works.
No.
The fact that he can bail on the works whenever he wants to go and see his bit on the side is testament to that.
Yeah.
And this kind of unspoken thing about Crofts Limited being kind of the ultimate status thing. He has all of this money, all of this privilege, so he can do what he wants.
It makes me think of something else that Birling is wrong about. Because the reason he loves Gerald so much is because he sees Gerald as everything Eric is not, right? As in, he thinks that Eric is basically a bit of a failure, right? Like, he's not, they obviously don't really acknowledge his drinking, but they're probably aware of it in some respects. And, he's sort of not, he's just not the man, that Birling, or the son, you're not the kind of father a son can go to when he's in trouble, that really quite poignant line.
Yeah.
The irony being, of course, that Gerald is probably not either. Like, as in he's a show-off, right? And yet, because of the name Croft and because of all of the power that Birling knows that will bring, he either doesn't see that or he ignores it. But either way, it's another kind of example of his sort of naive. Is it naivety? Or just his kind of something that he's just not right about.
He's short-sighted. He's
short-sighted,
myopic, isn't he? Yeah.
Totally. So Gerald in 1912.
Well, one thing that I would comment on, which is 1912, 1945 kind of spanning, is that as much as a modern audience thinks, oh, Gerald, ugh. He's painted in a positive light.
100%.
And it's not even just that he self-fashions himself as the fairy prince. It is also that the other characters on the stage, and even the inspector, seem to kind of dismiss his role as not that bad.
No. Because he loves her?
Yeah. The inspector says at least he showed some affection and made her happy for a time. Like, it's absurd.
Yeah.
Because,
I mean, go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, just he gets away with all of it, and I think that he's really quite a bad person.
Yeah.
Like even the way that he talks about women. He says that he hates those hard-eyed, dough-faced women at the Palace Bar, but is still going there publicly to see this favourite haunt of women of the town. He's clearly visiting prostitutes on the regular until he finds one who is soft-faced enough, soft-eyed, dough-eyed rather than dough-faced.
Yeah, but also vulnerable, so that he can step in. And I think this is where, if we want to just jump, briefly to our current period of time, this is where his character actually, in our, very important discussions around power in relationships and consent and sort of just male behaviour, when men in positions of power, he is textbook sorry, no. Because wild, actually, you know what, that's actually a really nice thing to do. She's being leched upon by this Megati guy, and he steps in, and that's right. You see it all over the tube and on the trains and stuff. Like if you're seeing behaviour like this, step in and support. What it doesn't go on to say is then once you've done that, set them up in a flat and treat them as your mistress and sleep with them. Yeah, basically,
and create a sense of obligation.
Yeah, where they have to, and that's really it's a really complex conversation.
Yeah, but I love that students that we teach these days, they get it.
Yeah, 100%.
They get what he's done wrong.
Yeah,
and they're always quite surprised when I've taught this text. They're always quite surprised that the inspector is so permissive of it and is very much forgiving, and everyone is kind of everyone still kind of likes him.
Yeah,
and modern audiences are a bit like, but he's such a hypocrite.
Yeah. And can I maybe just pause here for a second, because I will also say what I would really encourage students to do, and it's mentioned in examiners' reports and things like this. Yeah. Look, your Inspector Calls essay, or any of the essays that you write, they're not an opportunity to cancel JB Priestley, or to spend 2 paragraphs saying how vile and disgusting and et cetera, et cetera. And you may well have those feelings, and you're absolutely valid to have them. What we're not trying to push you towards is this kind of massive takedown of, look, they had it wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe Priestley had it wrong, or maybe he wrote his characters have it wrong. Whatever the answer to that question is, yes, they had it wrong.
Yeah.
We're not really writing these essays to judge them.
No.
Right? But you're well more than entitled to talk about, again, as we have with the other 2 characters, the resonance that it has today, which is that our perspective of these characters is completely different now. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't like to use this whole they didn't know any better, but in some respects they didn't, and they got it wrong, and fine. But I'm sure we've both read essays where maybe kids get a little bit carried away with this, and before you know it, you've read a massive takedown about how we should never read Inspector Calls again, and how it's completely useless and it's completely wrong. And that's not really the intention behind it.
And I'm moved by it, and I often love it, and I think what a wonderful piece of rhetoric. Maybe save that for English language paper 2.
Exactly, yeah. Write your question 5 on that, if you really feel that strongly. So coming back, I guess, he's an interesting character to think about, as they all are, but just specifically over this time period, about how it's permissible. Permitted. Thank you. Yeah. English teacher's going to English teach. It's permitted. It's permitted over these periods. Is there anything that massively changes by 1945? I don't think there is.
Not really, no. I mean, only in as much as someone like him would start to feel potentially a little bit more seen, or I guess exposed, for not sitting in either category of what we kind of talked about before, where he's not really a capitalist, and he's not really anything else. Yeah. He doesn't quite fit into the role of the capitalist, because he doesn't do the capitalism stuff. No. He's very much kind of he's seem to be doing when it comes to the works. And so I think as we move towards kind of progressive unionization worker rights and slightly less kind of worshipping of the capitalist ideal, someone like him might start to feel a little bit like, okay, the cracks are starting to show. I need to either commit to being this capitalist, or I need to, act like the other people my age who are a bit more progressive, or just. He doesn't really fit in 1945 in the way that he fits in 1912, because he's so confident.
You know where he would really have fitted again? Thatcher.
Yeah.
And by if we imagine his life arc post, because he's probably what, 30?
I'd say he's
not gonna,
late 20s.
Yeah, late 20s, early 30s. I mean, it'd be a stretch to make it. I mean, the other thing as well that's hanging over the horizon for Geralds and Erics and stuff is highly likely that they're sent off to war in 2 years and dead. In the trenches, but even if they hadn't got past, he's not going to make it as far as 1979, and even if he did, he'd be a very old man. So it kind of is beyond. But the reason I mention him is because he's kind of like that prime Thatcherite, like an individual possibly, in sort of using. You can be powerful and wealthy again, that kind of thing. Whereas where he sits, in 1912 he's fine. Were he to have made it to 1945, as you said, cracks are going to start to show. Because he's a socialite, or at least implied in that way, I imagine that he would be a good chameleon, and that like he'd sort of pick up. We have to probably just talk very briefly about the end of the play. Despite what I said, he sides with the older Birlings.
He does.
And he actually doesn't go back to to the side of the Erics and the Sheilas, which sort of is it's intentional.
And he has that moment where you think that he's having the same kind of response as Sheila and Eric, where he's moved by realizing that she's actually dead, and he understands when Sheila returns the ring, and you think, okay, maybe he's learning, and then he excuses himself for a while.
To basically play detective.
Yeah, when he comes back, he's like, been busy.
Guess what, guys?
Turns out we're actually fine.
Yeah.
Sheila, how about that ring? He literally says, Sheila, how about that ring? As if everything that he's just said is no longer relevant because no one's died.
Yeah.
And they're no longer in legal trouble.
Yes.
And that for me kind of really just kind of encompasses Gerald as a character, is that it's all about appearances.
Yeah.
Everything he does is about appearances.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, he's very much like at that point. That you have rules and you have laws. And rules may well be kind of like, Well, laws, you're punished at the conclusion of them if you break them. Rules are much more kind of ephemeral, and maybe we break them, and sometimes these kind of things. There's a social contract, this kind of stuff going on. Because he realizes that it looks like no law has been broken, he's very much like, win. Okay, we're fine. We're not going to jail, and because we're not going to jail, we can probably just forget about the whole thing.
Yeah, it's all good.
And
my affair is just like everyone else's affairs.
Yeah,
it's pretty much what he's saying, which is a comment on like broader society and the fact that his affair is defended by various other characters,
including to an extent the inspector. It seems like
exactly.
That. It's a bit of a complex part of that play, isn't it? Kind of the boys will be boys undercurrent of like.
Sheila seems to be the only one who gets that it affected her as well.
Yeah.
And so, of course, she's not just going to be taking back the ring because there's no longer a scandal. He has still been unfaithful to her. And modern audiences get it as well. Yeah. A 1945 audience might have just gone, why is she still so upset with him? This is what blokes do.
Yeah.
She can kind of get on with it.
Totally.
And I think just as a kind of a final nice little thought which ties into this idea of kind of like rules versus laws is also a kind of a key distinction in the same area, which is between the word like guilt is used a lot in the play, but there are two meanings of the word guilt. There's culpability for a crime, i.e. you are found guilty, and there is remorse, which is you feel guilty about doing something. Now, nobody makes that distinction in the play, but the characters, in the way that they process their guilt, completely do. Sheila goes, I am both culpable and full of remorse.
Yep.
Sybil, on the other hand, who we didn't get to, is I'm neither culpable nor full of remorse.
Yeah.
And you have this kind of little kind of interplay between those two things the whole way through. And it's quite an interesting look at that word guilt, because it comes up in so many quotes that students learn.
Yeah.
You know, like, if nothing else, we'll have to share our guilt from the inspector, etc., etc. And I think that the engaging with that kind of two-part argument also taps into this whole idea of, like, you know, where do we put these characters in terms of their moral standing?
Yeah.
Like, how culpable are they, but also how much remorse do they show? That composite picture makes up their guilt.
Yeah, that's an interesting essay. You know, if that were to be a question on guilt.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
to
if
sort
guilt
of,
comes up, make that distinction.
Yeah, like, you know,
Run with it.
because that would be an interesting way to break down the characters, wouldn't it? You know, in that respect. Well, I think that we pause there on those three and come back to the other three another time, possibly in our next episode, where we could look at Sybil, Birling, Eric, and then the inspector, and even Eva, and even little Edna.
I think we need a whole podcast just on Edna. You know,
Great.
I get asked all the time, actually, will there ever be an essay on Edna in the exam? And I'd love to just play with you all and say, yeah, it could be anyone.
Yeah.
But just to clarify, although there have been questions about Eva, who never speaks, she is still a legitimate character because the whole play is about her.
Yeah.
You will never have a question on Edna.
No.
You will never have a question on Alderman Megati.
No.
You will never. Do you see what I mean?
Who else is in there? Some other kind of left. I think. I don't know if there's any other names. Are there? Megati, Edna.
The like the chief inspector.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. The inspector's boss.
Yeah. But yeah, so these little minor characters, like, I just feel the need to clarify before we finish, as much as we would love to do a podcast on the poor marginalised Edna, she will never be a question in an exam. No examiners would ever do that. No. So just relax. Eva could be.
Yeah.
But not Edna.
No.
Justice for Edna.
Great. See you later, y'all. Peace.